This is the Jeff McLeod Show, where we talk about God, America, the things that make our country great, and so much more. Good afternoon, everybody. It's happy Monday. It's 12:30 today, so I'm looking forward to the start of the work week. I hope you've had a good start to the work week as well. We're going to be discussing different content today. We're going to be talking about censorship once again. I'll briefly touch on Charlie Kirk's memorial service in Arizona and what I thought about it. I'm going to go into more detail about that a little bit later on a future episode, but let's begin. So we're going to start with the Jimmy Kimmel conversation, which the left has just been bringing up over and over again and mentioning that the right is engaging in their own cancel culture. So I'm going to continue to elaborate my position on this and whether I agree with what's happening or I don't agree with what's happening. So Ted Cruz said something that I pretty much agree with, and here's his quote. I think it is unbelievably dangerous for government to put itself in the position of saying we're going to decide what speech we like and what we don't. Right, that's the premise, that's the very foundation of freedom of speech. We're able to articulate our thoughts, people are going to be able to disagree with us, and in a civil society, we're going to be able to have debate and discourse and be able to work out our disagreements. Furthermore, he said, and we're going to threaten to take you off air if we don't like what you're saying. He said, it might feel good right now to threaten Jimmy Kimmel. Yeah, but when it is used to silence every conservative in America, we will regret it. And I share this similar sentiment. Right now, it feels good. I'm not a big fan of Jimmy Kimmel and his politics, certainly not. But in 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the road, this could have great implications. Let's go throughout American history and see different things that look good in the moment but hurt us later on. The Alien and Sedition Act, early in the 1800s, it was criticized at the time, and it's being even used today. And you can argue whether you think it's good or bad. I'm going to talk about that in another episode, but that was used later on. The Espionage Act, used by Woodrow Wilson, would later be exploited under President Obama. Land conservation under Teddy Roosevelt, which, by the way, I love national parks, I love nature, I love exploring, and there was a serious problem in the early 1900s with people just cutting down the giant sequoia trees and cutting down pretty much lumber that didn't need to be cut down. They could have been using other forestry. So I understand why Teddy Roosevelt did it, but now, about 125 years later, we're reaping the consequences. The government seizes land under eminent domain, and it can take personal property. You saw with the creation of Shenandoah National Park, as well as the Smoky Mountain National Park, that there were people that were living on those lands, and all of a sudden they were booted by the government under the name of land conservation. So that ended up being something for some people that ended up really, really hurting them. And you saw this under President Obama when he was seizing land for environmental purposes in the West, and different ranchers were throwing a fit. So things that happen right now can hurt us really badly in the future. And I'm scared that we're on a path as conservatives that we're going to regret when the next Democratic leadership comes into power. There might be hate speech laws, and for instance, Fox News or Newsmax might be told under the FCC, which we'll get into in a little bit, that you no longer are able to talk about trans issues or homosexuality, or we're pulling your funding, your federal funding, or you could be kicked off air. Ben Shapiro said this, and I pretty much agree with Ben on this. He's a little bit too libertarian in some areas for me, but I'm pretty libertarian in the area of free speech. He said the FCC should not be threatening action against ABC or its affiliates or Disney. Social censorship is perfectly appropriate. The blowback from the public is totally natural. But using federal regulatory power to enforce what he sees as political censorship is dangerous, and I concur. I obviously agree if a company decides to fire an employee, that's up to a company. If you don't meet a company's standard and you break or violate a contract, you say something you shouldn't, obviously you should be fired. However, the FCC is a completely different animal. The FCC funds and gives government funding to news organizations. And also it allows basically so that a bunch of networks don't intercross, right? So it would be an issue if you had several people trying to use 103.5 on the radio. The FCC basically ensures that multiple channels aren't trying to take the same radio frequency or television frequency. Furthermore, it also regulates broadband. It regulates 4G, 5G, and all the different towers, and it's very extensive. And we're going to talk about it today and about its origin and whether I believe it was constitutionally correct to found the FCC in the 1930s. Origin of the FCC. We're going to look at a brief history and we'll look from here. By the 1920s, thousands of stations broadcast on overlapping frequencies. As you can see, this would be a major problem. You want to tune into your favorite radio station at 102.5 and all of a sudden you're hearing classical music or you're hearing news commentary, and that's not what you wanted to hear. You wanted to hear the weather. So obviously we see that there needed to be something in place to be able to regulate broadband and be able to regulate different radio frequencies so everybody wasn't using the same exact radio frequency. Interference was constant and the airwaves were known as the ether chaos. I love that. I feel like the news media today could be called the ether chaos. Everything over the airwaves is chaos and just total dysfunction. So in 1927, the Federal Radio Commission began. Congress responded with the Radio Act of 1927, creating the Federal Radio Commission, which assigned frequencies and issued licenses in the public interest, convenience, or necessity, end quote. And we're going to see in a little bit that that was borrowed from the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, or the idea at least was, and that wording was put into an act in the early 1920s or late 19-teens. This phrase would later become the legal foundation of federal broadcast regulation. It's all under the public interest, convenience, or necessity. As we're going to learn, that is extremely dangerous wording. So what is in my interest might not be in your interest. So the government is determining what is in the public interest, which there are a bunch of bureaucrats and politicians a lot of times that have no connection with your everyday folks. So you can really twist that. Eminent domain does that. It uses the public interest quote, where if something is in the public interest or the public good, they can seize your property, maybe to make a park or to make a nature preserve or to extend the roadways. And you practically have no say. The only thing you can do is get just and equitable compensation. So I don't like the wording public interest, convenience, or necessity because it's the government determining what is of the public interest, and that is fundamentally against our system. That basically focuses on the party in power, and the party in power can determine what is in the public interest, and the party of power changes all the time. That's why we have checks and balances in our government. The quote, public interest, convenience, or necessity was not derived from any part of the Constitution at all. I researched this extensively. You never see this wording in any part of the Constitution. This bill derived power from the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The exact phrase, in the public interest, convenience, or necessity, first appeared in U.S. law in the Transportation Act of 1920. So what happened is the Supreme Court ended up borrowing some of the ideas behind the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. They claimed that the Interstate Commerce Act gave Congress and basically this bureaucracy the authority to regulate interstate commerce, interstate trade. And basically, we're going to see that they use frequency, radio frequency, as a type of interstate commerce, which I completely disagree with. And many of your Supreme Court decisions from 1940 to 1975 were incredibly terrible for our country. You see Roe v. Wade. You see different legislation like we're going to talk about today, NBC versus the United States. And you can go on and on. You could talk about the Bible, the removal of Bible and prayer in the public schools in the early 1960s. And you could go on and on and on about where you had judicial activists in this time frame decide to interpret the Constitution how they wanted it interpreted as opposed to being literally interpreted. So it was the Transportation Act of 1920, an amendment to the ICA. The Transportation Act stated that the Interstate Commerce Act implied this quote, therefore it was constitutional. And the implication in the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 obviously was for railroads, right? Railroads needed to be able to cross state lines and the government needed to be able to regulate them. And furthermore, even cars, planes, any form of transportation that crosses state lines, even horses and buggies back then, the Interstate Commerce Act would apply to. However, the people who wrote the Interstate Commerce Act, Congress, they weren't even anticipating that radio waves were going to be used or television waves. So they took it completely out of context, in my opinion at least. President Franklin D. Roosevelt pushed for a permanent, broader communications regulator. The original document, which was the Federal Radio Commission, was only intended to be looked at year after year. It wasn't intended to be a long-term solution. So he looked at that. And in 1934, the Communications Act was published, merging the FRC with regulations of telephone and telegraphs. And like I said, there was a need for some sort of either organization or government branch that was going to be able to regulate purely from a standpoint that people can't be using and stations cannot be using the same frequency, because if they do, there's going to be chaos, the other chaos. So the FCC ended up being created. This created the Federal Communications Commission, which is also in place today and regulates the TV, what can be said on TV, government funding going to stations, and also it regulates and it makes sure that monopolies aren't built on television, so that larger companies can't just buy a million networks. So the FCC is responsible for that. The FCC was given authority over all interstate and international communications by wire and radio, later expanded to TV, satellites, cable, and eventually parts of the internet, which obviously, as things develop and things expand, you need something to regulate. So my argument here is not the regulation aspect. My argument here is that the FCC should not be receiving federal funds. And because if you receive federal funds, you can use those and weaponize those federal funds to pull funding from certain TV networks and stations, which we don't want to do in the name of free speech. The FCC was an independent U.S. government agency created in 1934 to regulate communications. Now we're going to be discussing the different forms of communications that it regulates, so what it has jurisdiction over. Number one is broadcasting. Radio and television stations ensuring they follow public interest rules. What is in the public interest today? The public interest, not saying the F-bomb on TV, right? Or saying big time curse words. That's deemed in the public interest. The public interest would also be accurate material, not false material. And as you see, that's very subjective. And if a Democrat is in charge, they're going to be thinking that the Republicans are lying. And if Republicans are in charge, they're going to be thinking the Democrats are lying. So this is very, very subjective. And this is where I start seeing issues with the FCC. First of all, and we're going to look into the Supreme Court case, NBC versus the United States, and we're going to see how I don't believe the Supreme Court followed the Constitution at the time. Secondly, the FCC is responsible for regulating telecommunications, telephone services, satellite, and cable. Thirdly, wireless communications, cell phone spectrum licensing, and 5G networks. They have to make sure that they all apply to code, that there's some sort of regulation in place, and that they are in the public interest. Fourthly, internet. Issues related to broadband access, net neutrality, depending on the administration, and consumer protections. So the FCC, in theory, could hand money out to promote more people having easy Wi-Fi and easy reception. The FCC, that would be in their power to be able to do so. So public safety, emergency alert systems and communications reliability during disasters. That's huge. We need that. We need our SOS. We need different forms of communication in case other forms go out. I do think something that changes all of this is Elon Musk, and Elon Musk being able to use his service to be able to pick up Wi-Fi or satellites in the middle of a natural disaster. The FCC is led by 5 commissioners appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So you see the problems we're starting to run into with a regulatory agency that receives government money. When you receive government money and you're appointed by the president, so you're probably a friend of the president and you're serving the president's interest, and then the president also picks the other 4 commissioners who have to get confirmed by the Senate. Now all of a sudden you have a group of people that are all on one political party's side. So when I'm talking about Jimmy Kimmel, obviously I'm not for Jimmy Kimmel's politics. I'm very conservative and I disagree with him. And part of me on the inside was happy that he was let go and he was suspended. But on the other hand, I see the issues that are going to arise in the future when Democrats appoint 5 commissioners, they get confirmed by the Senate, and all of a sudden we're complaining and we're saying, they're regulating, they're threatening to pull funding from Fox News. They're threatening to pull FCC funding from Newsmax. They're threatening to pull FCC funding from the One America station. And we're all going to say, why are they doing that? And they can say, you used it against us. So we don't want to be culpable. We don't want to be blamable in that situation. So we want to we need to be sure, absolutely sure, that something violates guidelines. Here is why the FCC was deemed legal. Okay, and you're going to see that it's extremely shoddy, as I've already gone over a little bit, as to why, as to its legality and to why the Supreme Court ruled in its favor. The FCC's authority comes from Congress, but the commissioner, right, is appointed by the president. So clearly there is some presidential sway, but it is funded by Congress. So if you have a majority Republican Congress, they could threaten to pull FCC funding for Democratic-leaning news channels. On the flip side, if you have a Democratic Congress, and they could threaten to basically pull funding from conservative news sites. So you see how the FCC has some serious ethical problems, which I see at least. And I think it needs to be overturned. And this has become a bureaucratic system. And we need to decrease the number of bureaucrats in our government. So the FCC's authority comes from Congress, specifically, as I mentioned, the Communications Act of 1934, later amended by the Telecommunications Act of 1996. Congress justified it under the Commerce Clause, which allows federal regulation of interstate commerce. I do not believe at all that the founders thought that waves they never knew about in the air were part of interstate commerce. I mean, if you want to say Amazon's part of interstate commerce, sure, or whatever, buying or Shein or whatever type of online organization you buy from. But by and large, it's not. It's not commerce. It's just the information. It's the ready exchange of information by and large. We're able to pull our phones, obviously, and get anything in a minute's notice. We're able to go on the TV and watch whatever station we want. We're able to go on the radio, tune into whatever station we want right now on AM or FM. So it regulates this. Because broadcast signals cross state lines, they were considered interstate commerce. So you would need some sort of federal agency to regulate this, but I don't believe you needed to use the commerce section of the Constitution, the Commerce Clause, because it's clearly taken way out of context. So if you wanted to make a constitutional amendment, absolutely, because that's constitutional. But to set something aside and say it's constitutional, when in reality it's really not, and you're making something a giant stretch, I have a problem with that. The Supreme Court upheld the reasoning in cases like the NBC versus United States ruling in 1943, as I've already mentioned, which confirmed the FCC could regulate licenses to serve the public interest, which is extremely vague. So legally, the FCC exists for three reasons. Congress created it by law, so it was passed by law. However, I don't think it used the Constitution. It's very slipshod. Next, the Constitution gives Congress authority over interstate commerce. I don't believe that should apply to this act whatsoever. And lastly, courts upheld its role as constitutional. I think it should go back to the Supreme Court, and I think the Supreme Court would decide differently today. The problem they would have with overturning this is there's been a precedent already set, so this would end up applying to a number of different acts. It would be like right now trying to overturn. So there was an issue about people, it would be like overturning the religious liberty clause, where if it's something religiously violates someone's conscience, they don't have to perform it. For instance, like baking a wedding cake for a homosexual wedding and you're a Christian baker. There have been many cases that have stated that violates someone's conscience, so therefore they do not have to bake a wedding cake for an individual that they don't agree with their lifestyle. So, but there have been many cases, and there's been basically a judicial precedent set. So I don't know if the judicial precedent has been set so much already that they can't overturn it. But clearly, I think most justices, if they're being honest, would say this is a bit of a stretch. The constitutional justification, we're going to go into detail. It gives power under the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8. The Constitution gives Congress power to regulate commerce among the several states. So it can regulate commerce. I think it's a stretch to say that this is commerce. Radio signals across state lines. Congress argued spectrum use is interstate commerce. I would believe differently, but we'll continue. Therefore, Congress claimed authority to regulate who uses the airwaves. The public resource doctrine. Courts said that electromagnetic spectrum is a scarce public resource like waterways or public land. Now, this is a valid argument. This one I have a hard time arguing against. However, can't we just cut out the Commerce Clause of the FCC and just incorporate the public resource doctrine? That's my argument. There's a regulation of who gets to choose, who gets what airway, but it's not receiving federal funding. That would be my argument. So the government can still come in and say, you can't create a monopoly, so you can't create a bunch of the same networks. So NBC, ABC, they can't buy out a bunch of networks and control all the TV channels. So you still have the regulation in place for the public resource part because they are limited. There's not unlimited amounts of channels, and only so many channels are in the air. Because not everyone can broadcast at once without chaos, the government can ration spectrum in the public interest. I wouldn't even include public interest here. I would just include practicality. It's a limited resource, and therefore, because it's a limited resource, the government should be able to fairly delegate and distribute the number of channels across different sites. So one media organization does not supersede or start buying up all the other channels. Critics argue that the public interest is vague, arbitrary, and unconstitutional. I'm in that category. Very, 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 very vague. Someone in Congress could say right now, I think everybody likes chocolate. And because everybody likes chocolate, what we're going to do is it's in the public interest to ban vanilla because no one likes vanilla anymore. And we're going to make chocolate the only flavor. And you might say that's ludicrous, that's insane. And it is, it's a crazy illustration. But Congress could claim whatever they think is in the public interest, and all of a sudden the minority, which the strength of our U.S. Constitution is that there are checks and balances, right? The executive power and they enforce the law. Then you have the legislative branch, which makes the law, and you have the judicial system, which interprets the law. And I feel like a lot of that is out of whack today, but they're your checks and balances. And it's so if you have one party in power, basically there's regulations and they're not going to be able to take over and become a dictatorship. So to say for the public good or public interest, I have a hard time with that because the public interest varies depending on who is in power and is extremely vague and arbitrary. And like I was saying, the reason we have three branches of power is so that the minority has a say. So right now, the Republicans are in power, but the Democrats still have a say because there is a minority leadership there. That's why you have minority leadership roles in Congress, specifically in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate, you have the Senate minority leader. So but the public interest, it's not in the First Amendment, so it violates our freedom of expression and speech in my view at times because it silences the minority. Second, it gives unelected bureaucrats power to decide which voices get a license. So these people are not people elected by the people. They know they're getting appointed by the president, so they don't serve really the public interest, even though they're supposed to. By definitionally, they're supposed to serve the public interest, and really they could just be serving the interest of the president. And I understand in a republic that the president is elected by the people, and the president, by virtue, the president appointing these people represents the people. But I think bureaucrats are incredibly dangerous. Many times they hold power for years, and they a lot of times serve the interest of the party that elected them or the party that chose them. It's next, it creates a First Amendment double standard. Print and internet speech require no government approval, but broadcasting does. We have the power of the press, right? The freedom of the press. And the news media on TV, that's the press. And I know the founding fathers for sure would have said that's the press just as much as the newspaper writers are, just as much as an internet article is freedom of the press. I can start a website right now and publish anything I want on it. I did that for a time. I had a blog and I wrote a number of things on it, and I had absolute freedom to do that, right within limits. I can't make death threats or anything like that, or I can't defame somebody else, but I have the freedom of publication. The news media is monitored through the FCC. Most of the time, I think the FCC is pretty good and the leadership's pretty good and allows people and news organizations to present their values and to speak their minds. But in cases where there's blatant disagreement, like right now where there is a giant political rift between the right and left, I think it's incredibly dangerous because of the funding aspect. So I do believe it creates a double standard. Now, there are some questions. And if you're a logical thinker, you're thinking a couple things. You're thinking, Jeff, what about bad language? So the FCC does regulate that, and that would be deemed not in the public interest. And I would say it's not in the public interest, but that would be an issue to my theory. And what you could still have in place is just the broad overview without funding. And I guess without funding, though, you could basically say whatever you wanted. But maybe there's a threat of interference, or maybe there's a tax if you say the wrong words that you have to pay. Or maybe you're on a certain, like YouTube has, maybe there's kid-friendly channels and there's non-kid-friendly channels, and that's how it's regulated. I don't know. But those are just some ideas. Legal scholar Thomas Hazlitt called it a blank check for government discretion. That means they can kind of do whatever they want depending on the time and depending on who is in power. And Ronald Coase, Nobel economist, argued that the property rights could solve interference without vague public interest mandates, right? So property rights, saying this is a private company, they have their own private property, it's commercial, so they can air what they want as long as they are checking into the government regulation that they're into and that they're tuning into the right channel and they're not using other frequencies. Here's my solution. So we've talked a lot about problems. I'm a solution solver, so I don't want to just relish and think about the problems. There are solutions to problems with thinking. And by the way, comment if you're like, oh, there's serious problems with his idea. Comment and I'd be glad to talk to you, and I'd be glad to adjust my argument if I see a better one. What this commission would do. Instead of the FCC's broad mission, the new commission would focus only on technical spectrum management. Okay, this is where I'm at. And I wrote this out as to what I would think would be a better version of the FCC. So you assign frequencies and bandwidth. That is a must. That's what the most important thing the FCC does. Next, prevent interference. So all of a sudden, I can't be broadcasting on 103.5 with somebody else. Next, enforce technical standards. There should be power limits. There should be modulation rules and spectrum sharing. Next, there should be run spectrum auctions as the FCC does now for mobile carriers. So that should happen and you should be able to buy in. Next, coordinate internationally. Since satellites, GPS, and mobile bands require global harmonization, it needs to be a worldwide or something that's done throughout multiple countries, at least continentally. So we should be contacting Canada, Mexico, some of the Central American countries to make sure that radio frequencies and bandwidth is not violated. Here's the problems with what I said. There will be no regulation of content, political speech, indecency, fairness doctrine, etc. The only part I have a problem with is indecency. And like I said, maybe you create TV, sort of like YouTube has their software. You make it so that either kids will can watch it, or it's adult watchable. Maybe there's ratings like we have on TV, on movies already. And the show has to produce that, and if they violate those ratings, they're fined. Next, no regulation of business models, pricing, consumer protection, net neutrality, etc. So the net neutrality problem doesn't really bother me as much because it would be in a free market. It's determined by the viewer. So if all of a sudden NBC, for instance, there's no FCC, NBC keeps Jimmy Kimmel and nobody decides to watch him, eventually they're going to get rid of him because he does not have enough popularity and his show is not drawing in enough money or revenue. And then no public interest standard beyond efficient use of spectrum. The commission wouldn't decide who is fit to broadcast based on vague notions of public interest. So I think that's good. It would act like an air traffic controller. So it's basically guiding people and setting guidelines. Air traffic control knows where planes are going to go. It tells them where not to basically tells them where they shouldn't cross, and that's where they go from there. And it should be the same. Don't cross this bandwidth. Stay within your bandwidth, and everything's good. And if you violate your contract, if there's a rating that you have on your show and you violate that rating, maybe the rating would involve what words are allowed to be used. And if you violate that, you get fined by the government and maybe you have to reclassify what you are. The First Amendment would fully apply to speech content just as it does to newspapers, websites, and podcasts. And ultimately, it would put the power back in the hands of a company. And the thing I am the most concerned about, and you can listen up here, I am concerned as a conservative, not that NBC fired or whoever did, ABC, CBS. I didn't watch Jimmy Kimmel, so I don't even care. Whoever fired him, I don't care that they fired him. I care that potentially they were facing pressure from the FCC, which is indirectly coming through the federal government, that Jimmy Kimmel needed to be fired. Okay, and I agree with Donald Trump on many issues, but he was tweeting out for days that Jimmy Kimmel should be fired and that he was no good. And clearly he has sway on the FCC commissioners. So that causes a problem. So I think what should happen is the FCC should not exist in its current form, but people through the free market will be able to vote out shows. Like, for instance, I don't like Jimmy Kimmel, so I'm not going to watch him. And if millions of other Americans decide that, Jimmy Kimmel will no longer be on air. If people don't like Fox News, then they can leave Fox News. If Candace Owens has a TV show, and I'm not going to talk negatively about her because I would like to interview her at some point, and I'd like to interview anybody. I want to put that out there. I might disagree with people, but I'd like to interview them. But for instance, if Candace Owens had a show on TV, and by the way, I think she should if she wants to, and the government approves of that channel. But if she has a show and the viewers don't like her stances on Israel, she can lose airtime, right? So the market, the free market, is a beautiful thing. So it's based off of the consumer, and if the consumer doesn't like it, it's gone. If the consumer, all of a sudden, the consumer doesn't like popcorn no longer is on the shelf because there's not enough money generated. If a consumer doesn't want to go to a certain hotel, they don't want to go to Holiday Inn Express, then Holiday Inn Express will shut down because they're not meeting consumer standards. So these news organizations will shut down if people don't watch them and they boycott them. Just like you saw years ago, Target, when they started having non-binary clothing, that they received tremendous backlash from the consumers. They were sued as part of the backlash, but they received tremendous backlash, and as a result, they were losing money, and they decided, we want our customers back. So therefore, we are going to get rid of the non-binary clothing attire. And all of a sudden, it fixed the problem. So I believe that's the solution. I'd now like to remark a little bit on Charlie Kirk's memorial service, which happened yesterday, or technically today. Right now I'm filming, and it's about 12 hours before when you're going to receive this podcast episode. But I would like to say, first of all, there were some very, very good speaking performances that I very much enjoyed. First of all, if you're out there and you're listening, and you might see this in the future, years in the future even, and this content, I myself am a Christian, so I believe in biblical values. I believe that we are created in the image of God, that God sent his son Jesus into the world to pay the price for our sins, and that if we accept him and repent of our sins and trust in him, we can go to heaven to be with him. And that's the hope for our generation. And I believe our generation is waking up. We're starting to see God move. And if you're not saved, receive that message, because that's what Charlie Kirk would want, and that's what I would want as well as a Christian. But that was the first thing that I noticed. The presence of God was there. And many people mention God who I don't even believe are believers. Somebody like Tulsi Gabbard. I knew she's not a believer. I believe she's Hindu, but she was mentioning God. And there were several different people. Marco Rubio mentioned God. Donald Trump Jr. mentioned God. Frank Kolek, I believe that's his name, or Kotek, the Bible apologist, obviously mentioned God. And it was just person after individual after person who decided that they were going to speak about God. Tucker Carlson, and the presence of God was there. And I hope many people received Jesus Christ and accepted him as their personal Savior in that event. The second major point that stuck out was Erica Kirk's speech. What a gracious woman. It actually brought tears to my eyes when she said that She forgave Tyler Robinson because that's what Charlie would want, and that's what Jesus did. Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And you think about Stephen in the Bible, who said, Lord, lay not this sin on their charge. And she did that today with her husband. And what man meant for evil, God meant for good. And today we could see a massive awakening, both most importantly religiously, and secondly politically, because of the gracious stand that Erica Kirk took, as well as the different individuals. The third thing I noticed was just how much Charlie Kirk was loved around the world. Millions of people were listening to him. It was projected before today, and it will be interesting in future episodes speaking about this, how many people tuned in to Charlie Kirk's memorial service. Even all you haters out there, I saw you commenting on his memorial. So he was important enough for you to comment. So therefore, he must have been a pretty important individual. So I saw that. Next, I noticed from Erica Kirk's speech, she mentioned that how necessary it is for there to be strong, manly fathers in America. And that is incredibly important. Without fathers, without manly fathers and people who decide to take responsibility, our country's in trouble, and we as Christians are in trouble. I also noticed there was Dr. Ben Carson spoke and did an excellent job, and it was just very, very well run in a short period of time. So I'm going to have more thoughts on individualized quotes tomorrow, but I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please stay tuned for more. There's a lot more coming. We have big things coming. This is only the start. We are going to build a movement here in the Northeast that is going to shake every single state. It's going to shake New Jersey. It's going to shake Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New York, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Massachusetts. And it's going to build. And we're going to turn this part of the country conservative, and most importantly, people are going to get saved and they're as a result of this. So we're going to open our dialogue and we're going to grow. So this is only the start. Tune in. There are a lot of bigger things coming. Debates out in public are coming. Tours in the future are coming. But stay tuned for our next episode. And I hope you have a great day today on this Monday. Enjoy it, live it for Christ, live it to the fullest, because we don't know when our last day will be, just like Charlie didn't know when his last day on earth would be.